when you think about what AI is doing to languages. AI is now contributing actively to that corpus that we're all exposed to.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Slator Pod. Today we welcome on the podcast John Worne. So John is the CEO of the Chartered Institute of Linguists, also known as CIOL, and that's how I'm going to refer to in this podcast. So the CIOL is the UK's chartered body for language professionals and linguists. Hi John, and thank you so much for joining today.
My real pleasure, Florian. Great to be here.
So what part of the world are you recording this from today? I hope from the UK.
I am in the UK, yes. I'm in lovely London. It's a little grey today. We've had the most wonderful weather lately, but it's nice to be here as the spring springs.
Absolutely. Second podcast in a row that we're recording from London. So great. So let's set the scene a little bit. Your career spans, all kinds of areas: government, higher education, business, and now linguistics. Can you just recount for us a little bit what led you to take on the leadership of the CIOL, and prior to that, what were some of the other kind of stations in the journey there?
Sure. Well, I started my working life working for international businesses. So I worked all over the world, in Russia, in South America, in Europe, Southeast Asia, and I lived for a time in Hong Kong and for quite some while in Paris. So I suppose that was my first exposure to languages, living and working in other countries. Working in France, that's where I picked up my French, which is fine. Then I had a stint in UK central government, which was really interesting, public services reform policy. I moved on from there to join the British Council, which is the UK's cultural and educational body. I had a super time there promoting languages and education for about 8 years. Then I worked in a couple of big universities, UK universities, and then on to the Chartered Institute of Linguists. So the common thread for all of these things was international. I've always worked internationally, spent a lot of time living and working overseas. Languages as part of that, and then education and culture, pretty strong ingredient as well. But also, I guess, given the stints in government, I have an appreciation of public policy, and also a strong sense of public service and public benefit. So all of those things kind of came together for me with CIOL. Basically, we are in effect working for the public good, as well as obviously for the good of linguists and languages. The other thing, Florian, is personally, I love languages myself. So I speak French. I've learned Italian more or less over the last 6 years. I'm working on Japanese, Chinese, and German. I've got a bit of Spanish from my time in South America, and I've also studied linguistics for a fair bit, so I can bore you about Proto-Indo-European and various other language families. And I think the more you immerse yourself in languages, the more fascinating it is, really. So it's a joy to combine a job with something that I would do if I wasn't working. I would be tooling about with languages.
A little bit of Cantonese from your time in Hong Kong, or not? For me, it was super hard. I lived there for 3 years, and
really, I think I got 1 to 10. Yeah, yi sam se lo chat back gao sap. So and tai shi and YCK whiskey was a good one. So probably more of the loan words. I think the thing I learnt there was and it's so hard, I think, especially if English is your first language, because English is so flat in terms of tonally. It's terribly flat. And of course, you have to have some tonality in order to communicate at all in Chinese languages. So getting tonality in was the hardest thing, and to some extent getting it wrong. But as long as you get some tones, at least people know you're trying. So I do think, again, this is the fascinating thing about learning more languages. You come to appreciate the different ways in which languages do the same essential jobs, but endless fascination in the study thereof.
Yeah, I mean, to me, Chinese just brought home just how closely related, I guess, Indo-European languages are. When you kind of look at Chinese and the Japanese, it's just the difference is so vast, and the concepts are so different. On my personal bucket list to eventually master it at some point.
I've given up on mastery. I think the crucial thing is to relax into languages. And but anyway, we'll come on to that in the questions. It would be an interesting thing to talk about. Everyone's different in this respect, but I think letting go of mastery And fluency is one of the things that certainly has helped me.
Tell us a bit more about first kind of the structure of what is a UK Royal Chartered Body, and then can maybe segue to the CIOL specifically. What's its core mission? How does it support language professionals today?
The idea behind Royal Chartered Bodies is that they have they have governance which effectively goes to Parliament, and the central idea is that you're for public good. So not for profit and for public good is the main driving idea. And what that means in our case is obviously we're for linguists and for languages. So a Royal Chartered Body is there in effect to promote the particular group or topic that it looks after. And we're obviously linguists and languages. But what's interesting is in our founding documents, it also talks about promoting intercultural understanding and an appreciation of other cultures and languages. So I think there's the idea that you're there to do good in effect, and be a friend and partner to all like-minded organisations who are trying to do good, in your particular métier. So we think it's very, very important to work with other bodies, to partner. And even if we don't agree on everything, try to work with other organisations if it's in the interests of promoting languages and linguists. And then the other things that we do, obviously we look after language professionals, so translators, interpreters, people who work, who have languages in universities, etc. And we also offer professional qualifications, so high-level professional qualifications that demonstrate your competence as an interpreter or as a translator.
So the term linguist is quite broad. It's not limited to translators, interpreters. It's, language learners and even like linguistics as an academic
exactly
field.
all the birds of the the aviary, really. We have all types. Undoubtedly, the organisation has more translators in our midst than any other group. So it's probably number one is translators. Joint second would be university educators and interpreters. And then we have people who use their languages in business, diplomacy, armed forces, those sorts of things. So quite a broad church.
And the focus is on the UK. So there wouldn't even be a mandate to go abroad or go.
Oh no, we're absolutely international. So we've got members in 91 countries, speaking 117 different languages, and absolutely international. So many people will, I think a common denominator, generally speaking, will be the English language. It would be unusual for someone to be a member who didn't have English as one of their languages. But more than a quarter of our members are based overseas. And even in the UK, more than half of our members have English as their language of qualification, which means that they weren't born in the UK. They were born somewhere else. So, yeah, we're a pretty international organisation.
All right. And so for 3 years now, we've been living through this sea change, this revolution, for lack of a better term, where now machines can actually generate writing and can generate all kinds of things that used to be the domain of humans. We call it AI now, but it's probably just the catch-all term. So what are you hearing from members on the kind of actual real-life impact of AI and the adoption of AI by businesses, by academia, on the linguists? That's kind of a broad term, working in the field, having their professional careers in their field.
It's a mixed picture, I think it's fair to say. And you won't need me to tell you that AI as an umbrella term combines a lot of different things, lots of different tools, and a lot of different capabilities. But if we sort of talk about probably what is top of mind for most people, which is generative AI, in effect, which is the thing that's boomed in the last few years, and the thing that seems to be encroaching on various aspects of knowledge work and increasingly the work of linguists. Probably at the back end of last year, what we were seeing were quite a number of reports of reducing work volumes, that people were seeing work falling away, freelancers in particular. We were seeing figures from smaller LSPs, SME-sized LSPs, suggesting that they were seeing work starting to go away. There was a sort of first phase of it, which was it almost seemed to coincide with a period of experimentation by businesses who were sort of trying AI, and there were a number of stories of people getting clients back who tried it, it hadn't worked, and have come back to them. But I would have said that if you'd have asked me at the back end of last year, pretty stable trend would have been downward pressure in terms of work volumes for freelancers. This year, since January, we've seen a slight uptick. So I would say that in the latest polls that we have, and these are not large numbers, we're talking hundreds of people in the polls that we have, so we're not talking massive statistically relevant samples, but nevertheless talking several hundred people in each of these polls. What you see is a more stable picture. So as many people gaining work as losing work, and the vast majority of people saying no change. So that's whether that's a trend or whether that's just a moment in time. But certainly back end of last year, I would have said downward pressure on work volumes. This year, slightly more positive picture. I think undoubtedly everyone has seen an impact on client behaviour. So if you're working, with private sector clients, then certainly you will see a significant impact on client behaviour. What's a bit more complex, I guess, is what's going on in the public sector and in public services, and we'll perhaps go on to that in a moment. But I would say the other interesting thing would be, what proportion of people are actively using AI in their work, what proportion of people are kind of curious about it, but dabbling, and then what proportion of people are actively, saying, I don't want to use AI. And what you see, again, you'll probably, Slator's unmatched in this regard, you'll have good data. But what we see in our polls is sort of a 50-50 split, broadly speaking, between people who are, on board with AI and using it either in their core translation work, or if not in that, then certainly in the productivity, administration, marketing, and those sorts of activities. But you do see a pretty solid, certainly amongst our members, 50% of people who are resistant to AI, who vary from very resistant, as in it's the devil's work, to quite resistant. It's highly problematic and not to be relied upon. So I would say it's about 50-50 at the moment in terms of the feel towards it.
So you did mention briefly the public sector. Do we want to briefly touch on the House of Lords inquiry? Is that something you can speak to? There was a big...
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's a very interesting moment in time. I mean, House of Lords inquiry looked into interpreting and translation services in the UK courts, and that's a very important context because you're talking criminal justice system, you're talking people's lives and livelihoods, and you're talking about potentially victims of crime and defendants who could serve very significant jail terms. So important to get it right. So I think it was good that the House of Lords looked into it. I think what you had as kind of general themes going into it was a recognition that there were anxieties about the workforce, that interpreters weren't getting paid enough. A number of them leaving the profession, and therefore an issue potentially with support to courts. So that was the sort of situation going in. In terms of the inquiry itself, there were a number of people on the committee who were very, very pro-AI, who wanted the answer to be AI is going to solve this. And pretty much uniformly across all of the evidence that was given, there were real issues identified, certainly with the use of AI for interpreting. And of course, the main issue is, and this is the issue for public service context more generally, is the breadth of what would need to be delivered, because the UK courts have a phenomenal number of languages which are required. And as we know, AI's performance tails off spectacularly in lower resource languages. So because the UK courts need 30, 60, 80 languages on a routine basis, it's always going to be difficult for AI to do that sort of job. So I would say that overall the inquiry was, well, firstly, it was great that the Houses of Parliament got interested in a core matter for language professionals. And we did a lot of work to get them interested in it, but nevertheless great that they took that interest. It was a really, really serious-minded piece of work. And I would commend to anyone, read the report on the House of Lords website. It's a really good read. They've absolutely understood what these language services are, the nuances within them, and how complex they are to deliver. And they've given government a very fair-minded set of recommendations around supporting and maintaining the workforce, taking care with any kind of AI adoption to make sure it's thoroughly piloted and doesn't create unfairness or inequalities. and generally speaking, a very progressive and right-minded report. So I think the good news there is that, because languages can sometimes feel like a bit of a Cinderella subject, especially in the UK, where we are still dominated in many contexts by a kind of English first kind of mentality, it was absolutely terrific to see, one of the chambers of our democracy properly engage with the complexities of languages.
I mean, it was by far the most detailed, nuanced picture or report I've ever seen coming out of the public sector, and it was very participatory, for lack of a better term, right? I mean, you had actually people from all kinds of companies and institutions appear in Parliament for questions, right? There were like hours and hours of question. It was all publicly available, and then the eventual report was amazing. So I do encourage everybody to go and look at this. We felt a bit almost intimidated on the Slator side to try to summarize it. It was almost
tricky to summarize, isn't it? Yeah.
How do you summarize something like this? You take all the nuance out again, right?
I agree with you. I think that was exactly what I said when we received it, that, in many ways, if I was to imagine the dream version of myself, that's probably the report I would have imagined myself writing. I mean, you have to say, we do sometimes in this country, as all countries do, knock public servants and knock civil servants. The people behind the scenes who quietly heard, some quite conflicting points of view, people who had an agenda presenting, and just saw through all of that and got to the underlying, pretty objective articulation of the reality. It's a great piece of work. And I do think it will stand us in good stead for a number of years. I mean, we host delegations from other countries, and whilst I think we would always be very humble about the UK's public sector, nevertheless, it's great to be able to share something that is really useful for other countries. I had a person over from Japan the other month who, they're looking into what they could do in the Japanese courts, and it's great to be able to share something that's a comprehensive articulation of a complex and well-rounded system.
So you've described language skills in a piece back, I think it's in early 2024, we quoted you as saying that language skills are the ultimate human meta skills.
Yes.
Meta skill. So to tell us more about that, can you elaborate on that and what do you mean by this?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I could bore for Britain on this, but, the essence of it really is that, we are obviously here engaging in language. We absolutely think in language. You can't think abstractly or without language. It's all encoded in language. And, language absolutely defines our interrelations. So I think the interesting thing about language for me is that the realization, which, I had in my own case, which is that, anyone exposed to languages just absorbs them. So you put a child in a linguistically diverse environment and they'll absorb all the languages they're exposed to. So we have a natural capacity and an absorptive capacity for language. But, if that's the case, why don't we all speak the identical language? If it was all just about communications and all just about whether you could master it, we'd all be speaking identically. And we don't. We all speak very differently. We all speak subtly differently within individual languages and very differently, as we were saying earlier, between languages and language families. So there's something else going on, isn't there? And what that is identity, diversification, and signalling. And these are the things that languages are also doing. They're signalling my personal identity, they're signalling my group identity, and they're embedding and carrying forward my culture. And I think this is the interesting thing for me about languages, and the fascinating thing really about when you think about what AI is doing to languages, because AI is now contributing actively to that corpus that we're all exposed to. So, I mean, the classic word that you spot all the time now, I don't know if you've come across this, the word delve.
Delve.
Which is
a rare one before.
Exactly. Delve is everywhere, and that's sort of AI's unique contribution in the last 18 months to the English language. We now delve into everything. And it, the interesting question now, it was a surefire sign that it was an AI-produced piece of text. But now people are starting to adopt it, of course, because when you're triggered and exposed to a word, you start to adopt it. So I think this is the interesting thing: language evolution, language change, and the way that languages develop. Will that accelerate? I suspect so. I mean, I think social media and digital tools mean that we'll accelerate in the pace of language evolution potentially. And then to what extent will we actively seek to differentiate the language that we use away from AI, or will we settle back into, an AI mediated average? And I think these are really fascinating questions for the future in terms of the way languages evolve, and whether AI becomes part of that evolution. I think it's bound to, and how much we resist it and how much we differentiate ourselves from it.
An AI mediated average. That would be an interesting concept. So, I mean, I can just tell you as a non-native English speaker living in a country where English is very important, but not the dominant language. Like, I mean, there is this kind of almost global overlay of English that just kind of punctuates, to various degrees the language of the land, I guess. And I mean, in this case here, German. And you can sense just that the continuous, I mean, encroachment is a bad term, but like, it's just English is becoming more and more and more and more important, while people still retain obviously their own language. So I wonder what the impact of AI is going to be, because I can already sense that in German it's a little less eloquent. It being, I don't know, the ChatGPT, the Gemini, right? And ChatGPT is probably the best, but it's a little less eloquent than it is in English. So yeah, I wonder if that kind of mediated average is actually happening even more quickly in languages other than English, right? Where the systems are a little less powerful.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point you make. And, when I was at the British Council, we did some work on what we called English 2.0, which is effectively international English, which is the English that everybody else than native English speakers speaks. And there are different norms and conventions around English 2.0. So if you are English and you travel, then, if you're culturally sensitive, you will learn that actually your English is not terribly helpful. It's actually quite hard for people to follow, and it breaks many of the conventions of English 2.0. So what you do is you actually change your form of English to work with international English, so it works more smoothly. And I think we're all aware of this. If you know another language, so for example, if I was in France, I would know, forms and expressions that I would use in English speaking to a French person that are not, English. They're English as adapted to the way a French speaker will tune into it. So undoubtedly, and this is the thing, isn't it, about part of what language is about is communication, but also part of what language is about is differentiation. So to what extent would I, choose words or choose eloquence which are designed to signal my, who I am, what my identity is? There's this woman that we have over here who's great on LinkedIn, Gillian Morris is called, and she has a Britishometer. And when she's asked to do a piece of work, she has to work out where it is on the Britishometer. Is it full shortbread and beef eaters and and the sort of royal family style English, or is it English 2.0? So I think these are the sorts of nuances that linguists kind of know very well, and linguists pick up very, very acutely. I think the interesting question is, will AI also pick up those sorts of nuances? And of course, many people will be wanting to hear us say, no, it'll never achieve that. I don't know. It may achieve some of that, but the question will be the pace of change and the extent to which those, the Britishometer, could ever be properly captured in a in a latest iteration of Grok.
100%. I mean, to me, it's fascinating how it's trying Swiss German, to digress just a little bit, right? We have this very diverse dialect landscape in Switzerland. We have probably like 30 dialects that you could probably pinpoint, and you can't talk to ChatGPT in Swiss German, but it struggles to like make a coherent response. Like, it's trying, so it has this like mid between High German and Swiss German thing. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see if you can get enough training data to become like fluent in a dialect at some point, because it is a very strong one.
It is interesting that, and I saw something. We had something at our conference around Nigeria. Nigeria's got 56, 60 different dialects spoken in very small areas. And one of the questions here, which is probably something we'll come on to, is what's your attitude towards training data? So if we think training data is a bad thing, and training data is basically having our intellectual property and our our own identity stripped away from us by American tech companies, then clearly it's unlikely that dialects will be heavily featured. However, if we decide that we do want to contribute, and that's interesting enough, one of the dilemmas for some of the African languages, then undoubtedly they will be monetized by by the current providers. So there are some interesting dilemmas around how we go about the training data, who owns it, and who takes responsibility for it, in terms of whether you would trust NGOs with that role, whether you would want governments to do more in these sorts of spaces. An interesting one for the UK, for example, because we have comparatively state-organised healthcare system, whether the NHS could, for example, be a quite rich repository of training data in terms of different languages, because you take all the different languages that are commonly spoken in a diagnostic context in the NHS, and you would have a hugely rich data source there. But at the moment, I think most people would feel uncomfortable with that being made available to large language models.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, I mean, you'd give it to them, this type of data, and they'd monetize it immediately. It would be actually nicer if some of these companies would spend time and resources on collecting that data themselves, like on the language side, instead of just kind of aggregating what's out there, with or without copyright or proper kind of boundaries, right? And I think, I mean, it's similar to like what Google did with maps. I mean, Google actually went out there with people with cameras and cars and kind of mapped everything. So they spend a bit of time and money on that.
These are the interesting questions, aren't they? Which, the optimist in me thinks that we might start to get to, in the next couple of years, having spent a couple of years in, somewhere between, either outright denial or complete acceptance. I think we're getting to, hopefully, we're getting to some of the more interesting and nuanced questions around how can we shape public policy to get what we want from these tools, as opposed to just having them happen to us.
So part of this is you're publishing of CIOL's AI Voices 2025. It was called, I believe, a CIOL white paper on the future for languages and linguists. So
yes.
Tell us a bit more about that. Were there some surprising or deep takeaways that emerged from? I think you had a lot of contributors contribute to this, individual contributors.
Yes, it was. It was a nice piece of work to do. We did the first version of it in 2023. And I would say probably the biggest evolution in the time is more acceptance. So over the 2-year period, you see people are more accepting of and more open to. I think what it pulls out are some of the obvious concerns, as we're saying, who owns the data, where does the data come from. I think it flags the high risk situation sorts of problems, which I think if you use AI tools, then you kind of know this. But if you don't use them, it's astonishing. The frequency and nature of mistakes. So mistakes with numbers, mistakes with names. The way that AI, like a sort of a 7-year-old, will come up with something and then tell you it's true. And then after you've pushed it 3 or 4 times, will finally, admit, no, actually that wasn't true. And those sorts of things, I think for people who haven't used the tools are hard to comprehend, really. So I do think, just flagging up how serious something like that can be in certain contexts, particularly public service contexts. And then I think the other thing that it captures to some degree is one of the the bigger, for me, very interesting trends, which is that most of the adoption of AI seems to be by individuals, and very, very little of it has been successfully pulled off by corporate organizations, because it's very, very hard to generalize the benefits of AI. So, the interesting thing, I think, for linguists is there's a tendency to think that that freelancers automatically are losers from AI, but to the extent that the main benefit of the current AI toolkit, or certainly generative AI toolkit, seems to be in the hands of individuals, you could actually see it the other way around, which is this actually quite an empowering and democratizing technology. So I would say that whilst overall, if you read AI Voices 2025, I think you would probably conclude that most people would have been happier if it had never been invented. Nevertheless, given that it has been invented, I think what you're seeing is cautious engagement with and recognition that it's here to stay, and therefore we need to shape it and optimize it.
It's just a very difficult transition from something that essentially was fairly stable for the past 20, 30 years, right? Since the first CAT tool came along, there wasn't really anything massively disruptive. If you had a computer, you were either in an office or you were maybe already a remote worker at home, and you had your area of expertise, and it all kind of, it progressed, but not by leaps and bounds, even as neural MT emerged. But now this is just disruptive, and I think everybody in the broader kind of ecosystem, right, in language, understands that basically we're the trailblazers in this. Like, there's almost nobody else that's as far along in the adoption of this than individuals that are professionally dealing with language. Now I think the software engineers are catching up because they're sensing, well, I mean, that thing can also code mostly, right? And they're catching up. But I think it's just a very disorienting time at the moment, and until it kind of maybe settles back into some kind of equilibrium in the next 2, 3, 4 years, which eventually it probably will. But like, where's that going to be? And I think people struggle to understand that.
Yes, I think that's right, and I think it's partly to do with the way our brains are wired, isn't it? And this is the central problem. A few years ago, a couple of friends of mine did an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in the UK on robotics, and they created this uncanny valley. So basically, the uncanny valley was something that was obviously a robot head at one end, and then something that was a human face at the other end. And as you walk down the uncanny valley, there's a certain point where everybody, feels creeped out, because you're at that place where it's the horrible hybrid of, slightly realistic but not realistic enough. And I think that's one of the things with generative AI, that it sort of triggers a lot of human emotions. It's helpful, it's solicitous, it does things for you, and it's very hard not to anthropomorphize it, and think, actually, this is a person I'm dealing with. It is almost passing the Turing test in some respects, in the way that it's bringing you in. But then you have to keep on reminding yourself, no, hang on a minute, this is just a data center, somewhere on the West Coast that's, burning through a hell of a lot of coking coal at the moment. So, it is, I think it's the uncanny valley aspect of it, which, means that it's all of your usual kind of warning signs aren't triggered by it.
Now let's go to the maybe the risk assessment specifically for things like high stakes interpreting or high stakes translation scenarios. Like maybe some takeaways from the House of Lords, maybe some takeaways from the AI Voices. What are some of the things that you're seeing there in terms of, okay, we may want to use AI, but it's still highly recommended to have an expert in the loop to make sure the risks are minimized, especially in court interpreting, right?
I think in interpreting this is a pretty clear-cut case, and I go back to my early career when I worked in Russia with absolutely world-class interpreters. I mean, they were unbelievably good interpreters, and as a skill, it was sort of off the spectrum of anything that I could ever have hoped to achieve in French. Simultaneous top-end interpreting is just an astonishing human capability. So, the first thing to say is it's a significant skill. The second thing to say is, as we know, across languages, performance is so very varied. And then the third thing to say is that in a court situation, people are deliberately trying to confuse you. So the whole purpose of courts is that you've got lawyers, certainly in an adversarial system, who are trying to get you to say something that you don't want to say, or acknowledge something that you don't want to acknowledge. So imagine you were doing that in your context, halfway between Swiss German and High German, with then you've got the slang words and the words that are used to disguise meaning, amongst criminal groups. And you can see that you've got all of the elements in there to say, how is a basic word generating AI in a low resource language ever going to, pull off something that's safe and reliable to use in that context? It's just not going to happen. So I think the second possible use would be as almost like a heads-up display. So if you imagine that you're an interpreter and, would it be useful to have something running alongside, which is just giving you the words? And you'll have seen the YouTube clips of people, doing Spanish, for example, with it as a kind of heads-up display. And it's quite useful to just throw at words and keep you abreast of it. But the challenge that's been shown in the research is it's highly specific to languages and which languages you're translating from because of the structural elements. So the pacing and the cadence has to be tuned to the individual interpreter, both in terms of their current level of skill to be able to use the heads-up display, and then secondly, in terms of the language family that they're using, in terms of where grammatical constructs drop in. So it's all, possible, but we're talking here about UK courts which haven't got adequate Wi-Fi and, are in Victorian buildings. So, we're from a practical perspective, 100 miles away from the point where you could put in place the systems and tools to make that work. So I think for interpreting, it's a bit of a blank end. I think the more interesting one is translation, where potentially in some languages you can see how it can be used. And certainly, we do work with some parts of government who, put an enormous amount of investment and technology into AI-based translation in real time, and do get some pretty impressive results. So I think in the hands of competent linguists who know what they're doing, these are formidable tools. So I don't think we should be quite so negative about it in properly resourced government contexts. But then you've got the chaotic and unsupervised use in public service context. So this is frontline public service workers who are just making do with and doing what they can in the situation they find themselves in, very often in hospital or medical situations. And there, I think the fact that there's no policy frameworks, no supervision and oversight, and it's individuals often acting, on their own initiative, you've got to have compassion for them, because if you're a frontline worker, you have to deal with the situation that you have to deal with. But I do think that it's dereliction of duty for government and public services not to put in place supportive frameworks that say what people can and can't do. And what we have, AI Voices, is a piece of research from Lucas Nunes Vieira from Bristol, University of Bristol, which shows very, very high levels of unsupervised individual use in public service contexts, which is risky business and puts us all at risk, basically.
So that's just people pulling out their phones and using whatever app is available.
And doing whatever they can, yeah.
So that's where CIOL could actually help inform the public sector and be part of things like the House of Lords inquiry, or just on a broader base and kind of inform policy making.
Yes, and I think the challenge for organisations like ours, and that's why I go back to, why a Royal Charter is an important part of our DNA, in that, I think it is incumbent upon us to look for solutions that can work. So it will be very easy to say, well, the bar needs to be the height of a pole vault, and and make it impossible for government to ever achieve that standard. So I think the dilemma for us and for policymakers is you've got to put in the ingredient which of course drives 9/10 of public policy, which is what's affordable. And if you look at the state of the world economy, you look at where most European economies are at the moment, and you look at the political landscape, it's difficult choices for most Western European economies. So that's what I think we also have to bear in mind here. What's an acceptable level of risk, and to what extent is it better to give frontline public service workers some tools than no tools at all? And there's a nice piece of work actually that I've been following, which the European Union's been doing. It's called Web PSI, which is an attempt to put some tools in the hands of people who are dealing with recently arrived migrants in Southern European territories. So, you might be talking Sicily or some of the Greek islands. And, clearly you've got people arriving in potentially in desperate situations with very low linguistic ability. And, how do you get some sort of support to them? And the answer is going to have to be remote. And the answer is probably going to have to be people who don't have the perfect interpreting skill set. But, do you fold your arms and say, well, if it's not the perfect interpreting skill set, we shouldn't do it? Or do you say, actually, a person who's just arrived with their family in one suitcase, needs some help? And I think this is where there's a balance to strike with public service. And that's also what Lucas Nunes Vieira says. He says, let's be aware of it, but let's also not prohibit the use of these tools because, frankly, they are useful and the cost could be too high. Opportunity cost.
Absolutely. Let's end on a note of the next generation, right? The new members of the CIOL.
Yes.
How do we prep them? How do they navigate that field, which is now basically an AI-enabled profession, increasingly so? Like, where do you see this going in the next 3 to 5 years, and new people joining the field? Well,
I'm lucky enough to have 2 lovely kids. Daughter who's 20 and son who's 18, and when my son turned 18, I said, that's me, done. You've now you've now achieved your 18 years, not entirely of course, but you've now achieved your 18 years, so you're free to make your own mistakes. And I think having had the benefit of raising children and realizing the very limited extent to which you can influence them on anything, I'm an optimist for the rising generation, because they will find solutions that that we haven't even thought of yet. But I do think that the penetrating insight for me is, if you look at most young people today, they are literally taking on board 2 or 3 data inputs at any one time. And if they're not getting at least 2 data inputs, they're bored. So my kids certainly can't watch TV without a second screen. It's not interesting enough. I've got them downstairs as we speak, revising for their respective exams, and they're both listening to music because it's just not interesting enough. So I think the interesting thing for the older generation versus the newer generation is how many input streams we're comfortable with absorbing versus the input streams that younger people are comfortable absorbing. So I suspect that the toolkit that what you might see around a translator's desk in 5 years' time might look slightly different to what you'd see around a translator who's in their middle to late 50s would have around their desk. Just because I think the comfort with tools and the fact they're digital natives will mean there'll be much less cognitive burden for them in multitasking across technological tools.
Wow, very interesting. Yeah. Mine are 9 and 11, and I can confirm you got to have 2 or 3 things going on at the same time.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, I think that also says something, as you were saying, about will we have a more stripped down or a more erudite version of languages? That's it's also interesting, isn't it? How short form content is so key for them. You cannot put children in front of a 1970s film. It just builds too slowly.
Slow. Yeah.
And there's no, there's not enough, explaining what's going on. They just zone out. They just can't cope with it. So I do wonder whether this sort of pace of input and short form content, is another factor. And of course, the sheer proliferation of content as well. So I suppose on the upside, there's probably going to be more content for linguists to deal with. That's for sure. I think we know that. But, it will be interesting. Does short form content need, high skill? Arguably, yes, because it's got to be really pithy and bang on. So these are interesting things. But, given that we will be constantly playing with languages, because that's what humans do, as well as, working in them, I think there'll be plenty of evolution to keep our kids happy.
What's on the roadmap for CIOL in 2025? Any new initiatives? Any events? Any lobbying campaigns that you're planning?
I mean, more of the same to some degree. I think the one thing that I would say is the recognition that I do think a lot of linguists, certainly freelancers, are feeling the pain. So I think one of the things that's really important for us is to try to keep prices down, have more free content, and make more of what we do freely available. So that's why it's great to be with you today, because I do think that content is really important for the number one thing, which is community. Because what you see, I do think, especially for translators, it can be a lonely business, and I think the feeling of being part of a like-minded community is really important. So I would say community and content are really important for us, and then doing everything we can to keep costs down and prices down, because we're not talking about people who are necessarily very wealthy at this point in time. So we've got to be mindful of their needs and responsive to them.
Well, we're doing our small part here, John, because this podcast is entirely free, and we're going to put it on YouTube. So
it's a wonderful thing.
Thank you so much for taking the time today. This was super interesting. Thanks, John.
Thank you for it.